Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and with us today is Rod, as you can see on the screen, but also with us today is Father Daniel French, Anglican vicar of Solcombe, and he and Rod and we're all going to talk today about a variety of things, religious liberty and passports and all manner of things. So at any rate, welcome, Daniel. How are you today?
Hey, I'm great. I'm fine. Thanks very much. It's a beautiful, we've got a bit of an Indian summer here.
Nice.
So it's really lovely. I mean, you could almost sunbathe.
We're having a particularly beautiful fall day. It's, like 70, bright sun. It's really perfect here. Rod, I'm going to go.
Can we stop, please? It's still high summer here in South Louisiana. Although the cold front, the legendary cold front is coming through this weekend. You would think that the fleet was coming back in, bringing happiness and Christmas toys because everybody's so excited. But
holding hostage to the British always talk about the weather. Right?
Yes.
Kale, I got to know Daniel through the work on the Benedict option and then on Live Not by Lies. Mm-hmm. He has started a really interesting project. Daniel, I hope you'll tell our listeners and our viewers about it, because it's exactly the sort of thing that I was hoping that the Benedict option in my writing would inspire in people. But go ahead and tell everybody what you and your collaborators have been working on.
Well, I think we were mindful that one of the issues that affects Orthodox Christians, not only in the UK, but I think pretty much throughout the West, is, do we know our faith? If we put, in these times, if we put Christians who are supernaturally minded, traditional in their understanding of Scripture and Revelation, would we know what we actually believed in? Or would we all just sort of stick to our own kind of denominational tribes, which is great in one sense, but maybe what we have with the oncoming years is an urgency to work together, and so it struck me after having read Rod's books that all this was great, but actually a lot of people in the pew and a lot of ministers couldn't really describe to you what small o Orthodox Christianity was and is. And could we assemble particularly young and upcoming writers, young theologians together to say, let's have a stab at describing this, something that is not compromising. It's not a dilute version of Christianity, but actually looks at what is it like to be an authentic traditional Christian living in perhaps the winter of Western civilization. And if we take Rod's analysis that we are entering into a soft totalitarian sort of brave new world, or more, or C.S. Lewis's abolition of man type of, technocracy, then how would we see theology through that? I think recently one of our writers described it as, how do we navigate away from the Matrix towards Narnia? Actually, when you start to come to that, you realize that you can use Nicene Christianity as a platform to look deeply in what it means to be a human being made in the image of God. And that there is almost in the third millennium, there is, I think, an exciting conversation between the traditional strands of Christianity to actually get this right, and to get it right quite quickly. So ours is a little contribution to kickstart that conversation. Maybe others are doing this elsewhere, but we thought we need to put down a reasonably concise text, throw the gauntlet down and say, this is what we think it is for this day and age. And that would be something that could be used catechetically, and that could be used for individuals and for those conversations between churches that are looking at the pressures at the moment and thinking, head scratching, and
Right.
saying, I mean, in England, we're really quite disunited between Catholics, evangelicals, Pentecostals, Eastern Orthodox Christians. Where we've not been really good at doing the sort of things like in the States, where Christians have got together on some of the hot button issues like abortion and euthanasia. Right. We've been very stuck in our enclaves, and this is a cri de coeur, I think, from probably particularly the UK contingent, to say, come on, folks, let's get together and just put aside 500 years or 1,000 years of debates, because the age that presents itself deserves our attention.
Yeah, well, as you and I were talking about, that one of the most striking things I found in doing my research on the underground churches in the Soviet bloc was this sort of ecumenism of the Gulag that developed among Christians in whatever country they were in, because they discovered once they got into prison that they weren't there for being Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. They were there for being Christians who resisted the regime. And you used an arresting phrase to describe your project. You said that you all were working on a catechism for the underground church, because you believe, as do I, that eventually the church or the churches will have to live partially or fully in the underground.
Well, right. And what's interesting to me about that, if I can jump in here, Rod, is that all of us in our respective confessions, right, have to contend with an official church structure, power structure that isn't always in sync with this sort of this deeper catechism, right? And we're all, and I think that might make a little bit sense in terms of just what's going on, with world events right now.
Yeah, I think the church can actually do. Traditional Christians can do well to learn to be at the very least, amphibian.
Amphibian?
Go ahead. I want more on that. That sounds. Go ahead.
Lizard people?
No, I don't mean lizard people. I mean,
I've known some bishops, my friend. Let me tell you.
I was just setting Rod up for that one, really.
Just to be able to. I think a number of us could potentially carry on working normally. Keeping the sort of show overground, but we also need to be able to work under the surface, and to be making preparations. Things are going to get tougher. We need to be able to be networking now, and building up those friendships and having those resources ready, so that we're prepared for whatever comes.
Well, one of the reasons I was interested in having you on today, Daniel, is because of the things you've been writing on social media and elsewhere about the COVID lockdown in your country as perhaps a precursor to the a dry run for what we're going to be facing in the future. And it came to mind just this week to me, watching, well, I guess it was late last week, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Moncton in Canada has announced that only those who can prove they've been vaccinated will be allowed to come to church and receive communion. You responded to that on social media by saying what exactly? Do you remember?
I think I said something to the effect of, bishops of wherever take note. That if this is the way that you move with the church, the Sunday that this starts, that will be the same Sunday that ministers like me start building underground. Seriously start doing it.
And tell us why. Why I agree with you, but tell us why. What moved you to say something so radical?
It's difficult to say this without kind of giving a whole spiel about life story and.
We have time.
But in a nutshell, I was fortunate after the bereavement of a parent in my teens to come under the wing of a diocesan exorcist, a remarkable Gandalf-like person who, in fact, the first book he gave me was C.S. Lewis's Miracles. He was a highly intelligent individual who was both parish priest, chaplain to one of Britain's largest mental health hospitals, was involved in deliverance ministries. And I would go and see him most days after school. And he gave me the sense that I already had of the reality of the supernatural, the importance of the sacraments, the sense that our church buildings are not just functional spaces, but that they are profound. That they are profound spaces. That the prayers that have been said in there thin the walls between heaven and earth.
And they are prayers themselves. I mean, it's the work. It's the true work of the people to create these prayers of gratitude and thanks. So,
if that makes sense, I inherited a deep sacramental sense of reality. I think I live in the old medieval world, where and nothing. I mean, I got a science degree, and yet I can talk about. I'm happy to, in the currency of my word, talk about miracles and the real presence of the Eucharist, the power of prayer, and what have you, angels and demons, and this reality. It doesn't faze me at all. So, to deny someone's entry into a religious space and a religious gathering, to deny them entry into a supernatural event where the Holy Spirit is dwelling in that space, to me, that seems scandalous. I was thinking, is the reference, is it John 6:53, isn't it? Where Christ, in that great discourse, says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no life in me. Right. If that's our starting point as Christians in terms of worship and liturgy, then to turn someone away saying, no jab, no Jesus.
Right.
Because that doesn't sit easy with my. Sorry, I'm a bit of a gut person, but that doesn't sit easy with my gut, and I just.
Well, because there's a literal, for us sacramental Christians, I mean, there's a literalness to that we can't just overlook. It's not like you're depriving, your congregation, of good preaching. You're depriving them of sacramental grace, which is real, as the three of us believe, and to treat it no different than, we can't hold this week's PTA meeting because COVID. It just is not of the same category. And I think in part, maybe, I don't know what this sounds like to you, Rod, but in part it's sort of, we feel that that's the way that the liturgy and the whole sacrament, the sacramental economy has been treated, certainly in my lifetime, that it is really no different than, a kind of meeting of where we just sort of go over a couple of bullet points and then we convene downstairs for donuts and coffee. There's something way more going on here. And to just simply blithely say, well, no jab, no Jesus, perhaps they would say that in some sort of tongue-in-cheek fashion. But when you hear that, that actually means something that has real valence in our lives.
Yeah, I was thinking this morning, pondering the implications of this. And in the medieval church, the Pope often put cities in Italy under interdict, meaning the sacraments could not be performed there for political reasons. This is I learned about this when I was doing research on Dante, because Dante was born into a Florence, if I'm not mistaken, that was under interdict. You couldn't have any of the sacraments there. And nowadays we look back on that with horror because we understand that to deprive someone of this access to Christ in this unique way is just abominable. And certainly for political reasons, you would do this. Yeah, it's not unheard of in the history of the church, but it ought to be unheard of today among us. But so, what does that look like in England, Daniel? What have you been? How have you been ministering under UK guidelines, and what's coming up?
Well, when it comes to the vaccine passport, certainly it's a real hot potato in the UK because, to quote Boris Johnson 20 years ago, any form of ID, he said he'd tear up and eat in front of the policeman who demanded it.
See, but that was before I was the prime minister. See, like
exactly.
It's different now. So I'm the prime minister now. So
there is we've as a society, we've never really had this sort of ID thing, but where you have to produce ID for even for age. It's not been something that's been natural to our culture. So in many ways, I think there's been a lot more resistance to it, and maybe there has been in the continent, where that's been more part of their history. In lockdowns, I think what was disappointing for me was certainly in the first lockdown, I'd say that the churches that rebelled were on the whole non-conformist, not even Catholic or Anglican. But it seemed initially it kind of mystified me. And when a few of us were instrumental in pushing for we had a letter that was written to the government. My Irreverend podcast, other podcasters were more instrumental than me in that. But we got about 14,000 ministers who wrote to say, we will not cooperate with a vaccine passport for entry into churches. But I have to say the majority were non-conformist. Right. And I find that quite interesting that they seem to have, on the back foot of COVID, be regaining a sense of the enchantment and the magic of gathering. That there was something supernatural and of the spirit, rather than just, as you mentioned earlier, a gathering where we just read a bit of scripture and do some PowerPoint.
But from my perspective, here in the States, it's sort of a running joke for a World War II motif, of like French underground movies, and you're against the Germans, is always like, show me your papers, or, or a Cold War, East Germany, West Germany drama. It's always show me your papers. And I always sort of thought that there was a deeper resistance to these kinds of, as you say, show your ID, show your passport. And it seems that kind of resistance is waning in the face of this current crisis.
I mean, I have to say, on a very practical matter for churches, the comical side of this is most of my parishioners, in terms of age demographics, would be struggling with. They're not. They are the bastion of the last people to buy a smartphone. And during that first few months of last year, I had various people, because I used to work a bit I've got a computer science degree, and I've sort of worked a little bit in that industry. I get people with, Nick, I've been posted an iPhone by my family, and I've got no idea how to use it. So, if we did have vaccine passports for church entry, I mean, it would just be comical. We'd have to add another hour of trying to navigate people around actually using the thing. So maybe that would be a grace of God. Make it impractical, like the Tower of Babel. It might fall on its technological needs.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, though, what sort of spirit of defiance you would find not only among the clergy but among the laity, if it came to that, if they had to break the law to gather for worship. I mean, it's what we've had in our parish. You know, I'm as you know, I'm Orthodox. We've really been fortunate because a number of churches, Orthodox and other jurisdictions, other churches, have been split over COVID. I know one Orthodox priest in another state who said that half of his congregation, you know, is furious about masks and all the rest, and angry at the other half who's furious, you know, that the others don't take the vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. And he said he's trying to hold it all together. Well, we haven't had that problem in our little parish because our priest has been really insistent on following what the bishops say, but the bishops haven't said anything about vaccines. And I trust that they won't, but who knows these days? And but I think that judging just from the congregation, the people I know in the congregation, I think most of us would defy the law to resist a vaccine passport command. But it's no small thing if your bishop tells you you must obey this. You know, what goes through the mind of a priest when he is asked to consider disobeying his bishop? Or it's one thing to disobey the state, but to disobey your bishop, that's something different.
No, it's really difficult, and I think, you know, we have to have informed consciences. I'm minded. I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that, you know, I think a lot of the Anglican establishment and hierarchy are just going along to get along on this, and really have not done an enormous amount of research or thought about the consequences of this. I mean, a real big hot subject at the moment in the Church of England is climate change. We're in this new liturgical season called Creation Tide, which I hadn't heard of till last year, to be honest. But, you know, we might have Harvest Festival, but now we've got Creation Tide, you know, and there are all sorts of...
That's a fantastic neologism. Wow.
All kind of weird and wonderful Glastonbury-esque stuff going on in the sea.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I kind of a lot of it borders on mind, body, and spirit. You know, I don't necessarily have a problem with the climate change science and narrative, but I do think the bigger danger coming up at a higher speed is that of the AI, the technocracy, you know, the Frankenstein monster that we've created.
Right.
I think vaccine passports come on the back of that. Yeah, and you know, you'll have someone like Rowan Williams, you know, an amazing mind, say, "Oh, that the climate change is the biggest moral issue of the time." And I kind of want to question that and say, actually, I think the AI super monster might be the biggest monster, might be the biggest threat coming up.
What are you thinking, Rod, on this score, with what Daniel's talking about?
Well, it's interesting. Just before we started the podcast, I was on the phone with a Dutch friend of mine. She's a young lawyer in the Netherlands, and she's taken a leading role in fighting the coming vaccine passport mandate there in the Netherlands, which starts on Friday. She said they lost, of course, but she refuses to be vaccinated. She said that there are only about 15% of the Dutch people who are not vaccinated, but she's watching the government turn the overwhelming majority of people against the minority resisting vaccination. She said it's Orwellian to watch how they're manipulating the public against minorities, the refuseniks. But she also said something fascinating. She said that one of the government ministers was talking about how the next thing they're going to do is a carbon passport, having to do with making sure the Dutch people fight climate change by having all of their moves documented. And I mean, she said that this is the camel's nose under the tent. And when I hear that sort of thing, I'm like, wow, it really is true. I mean, I may not have a big I mean, clearly I'm against vaccine passports for communion, but I lived in Hungary when you had to be able to prove vaccination in order to go into a restaurant or a movie theater. And it's not the worst thing in the world, but now that you see where governments are going with it, when they've shown that they can get people to carry the vaccine passports, well, we've already crossed a line that is not going to be redrawn.
Well, and this stuff doesn't get scaled back. In my sense of it is that once there's been a sort of a movement of the line forward, that it's not something that will be willingly walked back.
Right.
So I don't know is there an internal stopper? Is there some sort of cutoff mechanism or kill switch to this encroachment? And I'm trying really hard not to be paranoid, and I'm trying really hard not to be conspiratorial in my thinking. But
see, I never try hard not to be conspiratorial.
See, Rod, my role is to try to slow your roll a little bit. But I don't. But really, like Daniel, you said something earlier, and in one of my ongoing issues with the current pandemic is that so much of the policy doesn't. I've been saying doesn't pass my sniff test, but I think what you're talking about, you talk about being sort of, it just doesn't feel right. It's not, it's just something in my gut that is telling me like this is a problem. And I live in a very in American lingo, I live in a very blue part of the country, whereas Rod lives in a very red part of the country, and that just basically I live in a Democratic controlled state. Rod lives in a Republican controlled state, and you can imagine the sort of the basic ideological divides therein. But I none of this feels particularly. It just doesn't feel right. There's something about it, and I can't quite put my finger on. And so when I hear you say, the minute that the passport to enter a church begins or starts, that's where the work of the underground church begins. Like my ears prick up because then all of a sudden for me, okay, this is now actually really serious. Like we've gone out of the realm of the abstract possible into the nightmarish concrete or something.
Well, yeah, but that's it, Kale. The idea that all the stuff we've been talking about, wait, it's actually here. And I think this is one thing that has certainly caught my attention is that just exactly that things that I've been thinking about, one day it might come, lo, here it is.
Right.
And are we ready for it? One of the things that's been on my mind that has made me react to COVID, I think, differently from you, Kale, is that COVID struck just as I was finishing up Live Not by Lies. And I had been saturated in the stories and the spirituality of suffering, of people who are willing to suffer hardship for the sake of the gospel, intense hardship. Mm-hmm. And I looked initially at COVID as an opportunity for us to practice that. What would it be like to not to have our routine, our church routine, severely interrupted? Can we do that without losing our minds, without becoming angry and so on and so forth? And so when a lot of people in that first year were, certainly in my town, we had that Pentecostal pastor who was a real showboater who was saying, take me to jail, take me to, I thought that was real. Really, he was just being demonstrative and wanted to raise money.
Well, theater. It
was theater because I thought, what, we can at least try this because authorities don't know what's going on.
Right.
But here we are well into year 2, and it's become a lot more sinister. And I'm much less inclined to focus on let's offer this suffering up as a gift to God, and more like, okay, we have to offer the suffering up, but let's not keep our eyes off. Let's keep our eyes on the state and what the state is doing and how it's going to use the things it's getting us accustomed to against us someday. One example, I noticed the other day here in Baton Rouge how I pay for everything now with my card.
Right.
That's something that started during COVID. I have no objection to paying with the card, but in COVID, they wanted us to pay more with the card. When I was in Hungary, often they wouldn't take anything but the card. Wow. And so I just got used to never using cash. Okay, it's convenient, but now there is an electronic record of every purchase I make.
That's right.
I'm not cool with that.
Yeah.
No, apparently in China, there's the digital currency they've experimented.
Well, it's even
digital
it's
state
face.
currency in there.
It's face and it's face recognized on their apps. You know, I teach plenty. I teach a number of Chinese students, and they chuckle. And I'll ask them questions about this, but most of them live in the big cities, and they come here for school, right, for high school. But they never they don't even have to take their wallet out. Every now and again, they have to take their smartphone out, but most of them just put their face in front of a vending machine.
I'd heard this one that if you jaywalk in certain parts of China, the fine will be applied to you before you hit the other side of the road.
It's amazing.
Sure.
And the digital currency, because the state hates Bitcoin,
right?
Because it's democratic. So
that's right.
Instead, there's a sort of digital yang, isn't there, that I think is being promoted, where in a sense every transition has your face on it. It's as if you had a dollar bill with you on it. And that clearly has some advantages in terms of, you can have your tax done by a digital wallet, instantaneously in real time, and you can have your benefits sent to you, and there can be all sorts of rewards. And China has this terrible problem with the black market, and you can understand how that addresses that. But the dark side of it is, you can switch off somebody's ability to purchase beyond their house, which essentially puts them in house arrest. And you can make it so that if anybody comes near that person, you penalize them.
Yeah, you lose credit, you lose points.
Maybe your tax goes up.
It's like some nightmarish video game in which you're the poor stooge running around trying to avoid, the wrong people, right? I mean, that's what I think, for me, that's what this passport idea conjures up. You've got the clean and you've got the clean and the unclean.
You imagine somewhere like Australia, which has had extreme COVID measures, saying, well, we're going to implement lockdowns with military going around. Well, you don't have to have military patrolling the streets if you just by a button can say, well, you can't purchase anything beyond your house in this sector. You can't buy a train ticket to go and protest.
So I want to throw this out to both of you. I mean, what is there a limiting principle once you sort of, as Rod said, put the camel's nose under the tent? I mean, is there any kind of limiter here?
I don't know. I mean, I have two thoughts. One is the sort of Tower of Babel analogy that maybe these things have the possibility of collapsing under their own weight. That's my more optimistic view. And that as British, we love creating bureaucracies that never really work, that fall apart and that are clunky and slow and what have you. And so, and we've spent billions and billions in the last 20, 30 years on all sorts of apps and software and code that have been demonstrably useless. and ended political careers, and you think, well, hopefully maybe this will be the way that we go down. However, there's another side to me that thinks, using a sort of Jonathan Pajot view, he's done a lot of work recently on the other end of the Bible in Revelation.
Right.
You'll say about the controversial elements of Revelation, like the mark of the beast and what have you. Are describing a pattern of which tyrannies can stack up to the point where your only way out is really through the grace of God. That you come to a point where, as Christians, you can't navigate. You can't. If it's going to become incredibly difficult to live our Christian lives like we had done 2 years ago normally, then what can we but do but cry out to the Lord? And we are then in that kind of state of affairs. Now that's the more pessimistic, but maybe more spiritual potentiality.
Well, and I think that we know, I don't think we know, I know we know from the experience of the underground church under Soviet communism is that most people, most Christians will conform. Ultimately, most people aren't eager to be saints or martyrs or confessors. And we have to prepare for that. I think that's going to be one of the most discouraging things as we move into this season, is that how many of our co-religionists won't make it with us and can't be relied on.
Well, and not only that, Rod, sorry if I can interject here, but not only are they not going to be with us, but I sort of feel like I'm getting, they're kind of turning back at me, and I'm being treated like some sort of free riding, ingrate troublemaker by my own co-religionists.
Well, yeah, but and I think part of that could be that they resent you for having not made the compromise that they didn't want to make, but for whatever reason they did. So they have to be extra hard on you. Right. Yeah, I think that you were, to go back to your original question, though, you were asking about a limiting principle. Yeah. I fear that once people get accustomed to having this information and it being used for the common good, we're restricting people in this extraordinary way because we're facing extraordinary crisis. Mm-hmm. Well, it's pretty easy to do as I'm told the Dutch are going to do, like climate change is a crisis the likes of which mankind has never faced. It's the least we can do to, you know what I mean?
Oh, no, I know exactly that's exactly right. But I mean, but it's the same thing with the vaccine, Rod. It's like, it's the least we can do. It's all the same kind of language, and it elides so many things that you can't just elide through.
Well, you see, and in our country, Kale, what the social justice warriors have done, like with racism. Mm-hmm. Let's declare racism a public health emergency. Right. That's how the mayor of Chicago, that crook Lori Lightfoot, appropriated, I think it's $10 million of federal COVID relief funds sent to the city of Chicago. For COVID, she passed it over to the public health agency to fight racism, because declared that a public health emergency. You can see where this is going. If racism is a public health emergency, then why couldn't we have some sort of passports to fight racism?
Right.
You know,
have you done the work? Does your passport mark you as having done the work, Rod? Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Daniel.
That could be added to, identify people as undesirables.
Amen. I mean, that's precisely
politically incorrect.
It's the same pattern as Peugeot would say. It's the same pattern with just a slightly different name and iteration.
Yeah, you're unsafe to be in the presence of others, in certain contexts, and your digital currency, wallet, phone, whatever, is not going to allow you to do certain things within society because the algorithms have worked that out.
That's right.
And that's really interesting you're saying that, Daniel, you'll be unsafe to be around. If you have an entire generation and generations, plural, acculturated to the idea that they should never have to feel anxious or unsafe ever, then they will start demanding this sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And isn't that interesting that for churches, we've mollycoddled people down that path, and we've created a subliminal message of safety in much of our theology, particularly progressive theology. Mm-hmm. So the whole concept of salvation
seems to run
downplayed.
It seems
I snapped at someone a few days ago who was going on about, vicar, we've got to be saved. And I said, well, sound like an old time preacher here. No, we've got to be saved.
Right.
Yeah. And
well, it seems that the two actually, are on a collision course with one another, right? I mean, it's either safety or it's salvation. It's either, full protection or, opening yourself up, to grace, et cetera. I mean, they do seem to be somehow at war with one another. And I don't know, the most absurd kind of spoof on safetyism that we might have seen in the 90s has become our reality. So that an unvaccinated person is somehow rendering a vaccinated person unsafe. And so that the president of our United States says that we need to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. It's like, what? Like, what does that even mean?
Do you think also that there's a part of this that in the last generation or so, we've migrated much of our lives onto screens and into cyberspace, where life is more in digital, it's in ones and zeros. It's less, clearly it's not analog. So we begin to see life in that way, that we can purchase things like that.
Right.
We can play a video game that supposedly reenacts courage, and at the end of it says game over, and we're safe because we're behind the screen. You know, we might go even to the movies and see great stories put out and feel at the end of it, I identify with the hero, but I did so from a safe position.
Right. But all of those things are portal, right? I mean, if we look at sort of the inner reasons, the inner logic of those are portals to alternate worlds that ultimately allow us to re-enter the real world equipped with some sort of elixir gift that allows us to negotiate and slay the dragon, right? I mean, so our activities, I mean, even when it comes down to like the dreamscape, right? We dream and put things together in our sort of unconscious, our rational selves, so that we re-enter waking life somehow better equipped to problem solve in the real. But we seem to have skipped that step, right? I mean, everything is sort of virtual space or a kind of para reality, and there doesn't seem to be a kind of the proper re-entry into reality.
Yeah, this brings to mind the work of Dr. Ian McGilchrist, the psychiatrist who wrote The Master and His Emissary, about the left brain and the right brain and the making of the West. And I won't open that big topic right here, but he does say that the reason we in the West are in so much trouble is that in a healthy society, as in a healthy human being, the right brain, the intuitive faculty, the noetic faculty, it presents information to the left brain, which analyzes it and then sends it back to the right so it can live.
That's right.
We've been short-circuited, though, says Dr. McGilchrist, because the left thinks it knows everything and it holds on to the information. Well, the left brain is all about control. We couldn't function without our left brain working to ground us in logic and reason, but it's all about trying to control experience to make it bearable. But that gives you, says McGilchrist, a false picture of actual experience if you think you can control it.
And a false sense of security, right?
Sure.
I mean, I keep, you talking about McGilchrist reminds me of the way that Charles Taylor talks about, the myth of the porous self, and the myth, myth not as in like a made up story, but the myth is sort of a framework with which to understand the world, right? The myth of the buffered self and the myth of the porous self, and the sort of the one-eyed view of reality that McGilchrist is talking about has been incredibly powerful for us, but we seem to have forgotten that the buffered, protected self is itself a fiction too. Right. That we've lost our ability to sort of see with both eyes. I mean, Lewis talks about this with the discarded image. I mean, this is the very thing, and one of the guys I follow on YouTube quite a bit is Pastor Paul Vanderklay out of Sacramento, and he always talks about this, that we've been able to see with one side of with one eye, and it's been incredibly powerful. I mean, it has birthed the scientific revolution, and it has brought us all this kind of technological progress, etc. Yet it has blinded us to the sort of the dark side of technology. And Lewis talks about, Tolkien talks about, King's North is now talking about, Peugeot talks about that it has given us a false sense of sort of Cartesian control over matter, and it's not true at all.
No, I totally agree with that. And personally, I've found that to be very true in my own life. I was the kid that everyone thought was going to go to art college. And I ended up going to do computer science and killed a good hobby within a year. I realized Actually, I'm not the sort of individual who can do the Rubik's Cube and can do that kind of intense coding. I found myself really quite downbeat within halfway of this course. But when I looked around at my confreres, I realized that there was something about them that they were extreme left-brain people who had all sorts of issues with social interaction.
Right.
I mean, I think some of them now, politely say, will be on the spectrum. And I'm not. That's not a no disregard.
No, of course. Rod and I talk about this all the time.
It was an attractive industry for someone, say, with Asperger's to be in. And really, what we have at the moment, it's like that Dave Eggers novel, The Circle. We have the movers and shakers are the people that I graduated with at uni. Those kind of personalities are running the big tech. And it's where I think we're seeing something of the kind of safe world that they pine for being incarnated, through social media, through all sorts of influence that they have in the apps and the hardware, and this kind of digital safe world where we can migrate a whole part of our being. It needs to be rebalanced. I mean, when you look at the government's advisors for lockdown, SAGE, were there any artists, musicians, poets, who, let alone businessmen or entrepreneurs or whatever, but, where was that section of society to say, well, hold on, actually, that you're potentially going to squash something transcendent in adjusting our liberties in this way.
We defer to
society.
Yeah, but we've all been trained to defer to scientific expertise as if science knows everything.
Well, and Rod, to that point, I mean, all you have to do is, it would be an interesting experiment to look at the COVID headlines, the daily COVID headlines since, March, 7th or 8th it was of 2020, to look at the COVID headlines and look at how much we got wrong. I mean, time and time and time again. You look at, in 1 month, for instance, Israel is the leader of the free world in rolling out the vaccinations, and they've all, they've gotten to COVID zero. And then they're not. And all of a sudden, in this massively vaccinated country, they're having all kinds of quote unquote breakthrough cases. And, at the end of the day, if you're being honest, you can only say that we don't know what the heck is going on. We don't know why this thing is doing what it's doing. We don't know what the actual measure is. And so now instead we do theater. We do COVID theater. We do lockdown theater. We do, it's like pro wrestling. It's like, fumigate the classroom, fog it down, wipe everything down. Why? Because we need to make it look like we're doing something. And nobody's admitting that they don't know what's going on.
My Czech lodger, who grew up during the Soviet period, has a story of listening to, I think it was his father, who was an academic, who was thrown off academia within a few days for laughing out loud when a member of the party said, in the future, we will control the weather. And in this silence and sort of soft clapping, he just roared with laughter and lost his post.
And
ended up working in the factories. Right. And I think there's an element of that, that this technocratic mission to have COVID zero or anything zero, to have this sort of digitally perfect world where things are made super safe. I think in any system, one thing I did learn in computer science is something of the way systems work. To crank up to a perfect system, that last 5 to 10% requires almost the double the energy that got you from 0 to 90.
Yeah, and most sane people would just simply say it's not, that 100% extra energy to get to that sort of rarefied space. It's just simply not worth the resources, and so you learn to live with these things, and yet we are obsessed with this right now, right? I mean, that is what is going on.
And I think it's what Rod was saying earlier on, because we've not allowed that kind of right brain minded people to, we've done what the Soviets did, is we've pushed our poets and artists into a box, and our priests and our musicians, all the people who could enchant us.
Yeah, the ones that
the world is about a different kind of freedom.
The ones that speak to spirit have been relegated to bit players at best.
And the thing that frustrates me, though, and I know this frustrates you, Daniel, is those clerics who have done this to themselves. They didn't have to be forced to do it. They've chosen to do it. They've chosen to step back and not give the people what people need to hold on spiritually during this horrible, prolonged crisis.
Our interns and writers, we've been joking a lot recently about Lenny's speech in the Young Pope. His speech to the cardinals, and this sort of there's a lot in that speech that kind of needs to be said, particularly to the baby boomer clergy, who thought that they could create this utopian progressive religion that could once and for all put the past away and march towards a long future. And we were watching it again yesterday and just chuckling away, saying, wouldn't it be lovely to see someone high up in the church do that, and say, we're actually going to make faith mountainous. We're going to be elusive and mysterious.
Right. But there's no energy there, right? I mean, the energy is to promulgate something like Traditionis Custodes, and sorry, I had to go there, and turn our churches into NGOs, because that's all we are now.
Yeah, I don't know.
And as Jordan Peterson would point out, it's like, look, I don't want you to be an NGO. We've got plenty of those. How about you speak to the most deepest thing that makes me human and connects me to my maker? How about that? And we just don't seem to be really in any official capacity interested in that, which is why I think, Daniel, you're talking about this sort of underground amphibian-like movement. Maybe that's where it goes. I'm not sure.
Well, let me tell you that, I don't know if you saw this, Kale, but just today, the remarks of the Pope Francis's meeting with, I guess you've heard it, that the Slovak Jesuits came out, and he was talking about how we can't go back to the past, and he actually had the nerve to say that overturning the motu proprio, allowing the Latin Mass, was now the church can get back to the vision of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. I mean, the chutzpah of this guy.
The cynicism of that is just unreal.
But I think that you're the only Catholic of the three of us here. But I think that you probably wouldn't dispute that in the coming persecution, the Bishop of Rome will not be someone you can count on. Catholics can count on.
No, and the way that the Curia has been formed and fashioned and promoted, like, there's a pretty darn good chance that there will, though, as Francis himself pointed out in his first conversation with Scalfari, that there will probably not be another pope called Francis II. We can rest assured that the next pope will certainly be in the spirit of Pope Francis, and for that, as a Catholic, that's scary and sad for me. And I think it's bad for the world, Rod. As you always point out, it's like, look, I'm not a Catholic, but like, the Catholic Church is very important in the world to offer some kind of ballast against, the forces, as Lewis would say, against the forces of Britain and for the forces of Logers. This is so important for the Catholic Church to remember what it is and what she is supposed to be. And right now we're in a one big game of amnesia. It's really sad.
And it's difficult to see, isn't it, globally,
Yeah.
what voice or what voices could give a credible alternative that
Right.
didn't sound like a shrill,
Right.
and that you could genuinely say, yeah, I think, that's it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I've found interesting in the last 6 months, particularly, is definitely within my own tradition. There's a revival. I found it within myself for returning to older texts, to the language of the prayer book. I've found an increasing number of young fogies, as you might call them, actually coming together with a deep reverence for it. There's hope from the ground up, actually. And certainly in writing for the Spectator and podcasting on our Irreverend podcast, we found that we're getting a steady drip of emails and handwritten letters from people saying, often things like, I used to be an atheist, but since COVID, I think I've changed my mind. Or they've had some sort of supernatural experience. Or sadly, they've gone to their local clergy saying, I've read this, and I've read Rod Dreher, I've read Jordan Peterson, I've read Lewis, and when's the service on Sunday? And sort of, well, we don't really want your type.
That's right.
Then they've heard what some of us are doing and said, well, where do we go?
Yeah. Well, that's why, the reason why I brought up Traditionis Custodes is precisely, it was a well executed attempt at a kill shot in the only remaining energy in the church, which is young people, 50 and younger, who are drawn to old books, again, as Lewis would say, old books, old texts, old prayers, old liturgies, because in them is where we see the seeds of renewal for meaning, right? And so as many people before me have talked about, this meaning crisis that all of us are facing, that has been exposed radically in COVID or through COVID or by COVID, is that we do not know, right? Rod and I talk about this a bit. We do not know what we are for. And, and the three of us sit on the shoulders of giants because it has fed us. We have found answers to those deepest questions, the most, spectacular, telos of all. And I see forces arrayed against that. Now, maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Maybe that there would be forces arrayed against, the truth, truth, the goodness and beauty. Maybe I'm the one who's one more time naive enough to think that, nobody should stand in the way of something meaningful and good. But yet here we are.
I think certainly when you think of someone like Douglas Murray, who, a number of people like Tom Wright and one of our co-writers, Esther O'Reilly, has.
Oh yeah, I know Esther. She's great.
Has pushed on this, pushed him on this and sort of that. He's noted that he has intellectual friends who have decided to re-embrace or embrace for the first time Christianity, and that they don't go for the sort of decaf version. That they want the full crayon set.
Yeah,
they want everything.
That's right.
Don't just give me a little sort of pithy, bland version of Christianity. I want you to throw me as much as you can. Make it tough. Make it complex. Make it as if I was, in the middle of a battle of Mordor.
Right.
And he's, and you feel when he's speaking about this as if he is really wobbling to it.
Yeah. Sorry, Rod. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that this reminds me of how W.H. Auden came back to the Christian faith. He was in Manhattan, 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland. He tells a story about how he went to a movie theater on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in a German neighborhood. He was watching a German film, and they had newsreels before the main feature showing the Panzers overwhelming the Poles.
Mm-hmm.
He said people stood up in the audience and started screaming out in German, "Kill them, kill them, kill them." It so unnerved Auden, he had to leave the theater, and he returned to Christianity because he said that he had seen the face of radical evil, and the only thing he could think of that had the power to face that down was Christianity.
Yeah, because those spirits run so deep in us and through us and are long-standing. And the only sign of contradiction to what the world has on offer is Christianity, real, robust, sacramental Christianity. And so I think of somebody like Murray, these guys who, 5-10 years ago wouldn't sort of be in the same place, and I think they recognize that, look, if the claims are true, like if there is really this thing called a sacred order, then it is the only thing that can stand against the self and that the self wants what the self wants. Like, if the sacred order exists in me and it's not somehow external to me, then we live in the bedlam and in the craziness of our current moment, and all of its various iterations. But if there really is something like a sacred order, then darn it, like I have to orient myself and order myself toward and by it, not by whatever goes on inside my stomach, or even below, my belt, so I'm intrigued by somebody like Douglas Murray, who seems to be able to see that maybe there's something real. And the end of the day, maybe there's something real, because right now, if you listen to sort of the forces of all of these progressive movements, most especially, the sexual and gender identity stuff, there's nothing in that mechanism that would cry against it. Like, in other words, reality doesn't exist in that worldview. And I think Douglas Murray is being honest about, well, there's something real. And if we don't somehow tap ourselves into that, then it's truly a chaotic, meaningless void of an abyss.
Oh, that's what my next book is about, actually.
Right.
Not the void, the abyss, but about
the
how to tap into the transcendent, how to see what's actually there. And it's, the re-enchantment idea is not about going to sprinkle some holy water on the world and presto changeo, it's re-enchanted. Right. It's rather about learning to see what's already there, but has been hidden from our sight for a number of things in our culture, but also within ourselves. Mm-hmm. Ian McGilchrist has a new book coming out. It'll be out in the UK in November, but I've seen a chapter from it, and he has this marvelous metaphor in which he says the modern world is like people who've gotten accustomed to a magnifying glass that helps them see life in pond water, turning it towards the sky, and said how wonderful it is that we have this instrument that allows us to see the fact that the stars don't exist after all. Right. And that's where we are with science, and I need to help people realize, take the magnifying glass down and see with your own eyes what's right in front of your nose. Right. Well, I see we're at the end of our hour, as usual. But Daniel French, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to read your work. Where can people find you online?
I'm writing approximately monthly on the Spectator, so you can look me up on there. We've got a blog that a few of us have started off called Notes to the Underground Church.blogspot.com. And I podcast with Tom and Jamie on Irreverend, which is aiming particularly at those folks, who are looking for a renewed sense of the supernatural and concerned about the current times.
Fantastic. And you're on Twitter at what?
Oh, yeah. I'm Holy Disruptor.
At Holy Disruptor. One word, Holy Disruptor. Okay. Well, thanks again so much. And look forward to following the Underground Church Catechism project. This is hugely important. And this is the sort of initiative that I was hoping for in the Benedict option. I still get emails from people saying, so you've told us what's wrong. When are you going to tell us what to do? I'm like, I've given you lots of examples, I hope, but start it yourself. Don't sit around and wait for somebody to give it to you prepackaged. It's not going to happen. And what you all are doing with your international cohort of Christian collaborators is something that is just magnificent, and it's going to benefit us all. So congratulations to you for that. I'm very grateful.
Well, thank you for your inspiration.
Okay.
All right. Well, Rod, Daniel, this has been a great episode. We appreciate your time. And Rod, why don't you send us home?
Don't get nothing on you.
All right.